Hello everyone and welcome to today's episode of The Shredding Skeptic. Today we're going to be discussing a book called Overcoming Passive Aggression, How to Stop Hidden Anger from Spoiling Your Relationships, Career, and Happiness by Dr. Tim Murphy and Loriann Oberlin. So once again, we are going to be trying this in our live drive format as we take the new Scion FRS recently released for Project Cars around the Azure circuit. So let's top off the tank, prep our most biting sarcastic remarks as we discuss hidden anger. Alright, so today we're going to be diving right in with the Scion FRS Rocket Bunny Edition. I thought this would be an interesting juxtaposition for our discussion on passive aggression. So let's see how this thing lays down its 500 brake horsepower. Alright, so here we are out at the Azure coast, and we're going to try to do a quick navigation of this particular track while discussing our topic of the day, passive aggression and hidden anger. So I'll leave a link to the description of the book this is based on down below. And right now we're going to take this Scion FRS around here and do our best not to bang it up in the process. So, passive aggression. What is this exactly that we're talking about today? So, what we're going to be talking about is the kind of subtle manipulative behaviors that often leave you feeling somewhat uncomfortable without quite being sure why. Now, this may be something that you've experienced in others, or this could also be something that, you may be guilty of yourself, and I know this is something that is fairly common, and I know I'm definitely guilty of doing some of this myself, so I definitely wanted to share some of the insights that are in this book with you so that we can all be a little bit more aware of our own anger as well as the anger in those around us, so that we don't feel, I suppose, responsible for the way that we're treated sometimes by people who may have needs that have gone unmet. So, yeah, this can range anywhere from unconscious behaviors to, fully complacent coercion of other people, really just depending on how aware the person is of how they're feeling. Now, although this behavior does tend to be a ongoing, self-fulfilling cycle, the toxicity to individual relationships and group relationships can be quite palpable after you've had a strong dose of a passive-aggressive individual and the sarcastic and biting remarks that can often leave you feeling perhaps a little bit less than. But often it's so subtle that it's not really something you feel comfortable perhaps calling the individual out on. But this chronic irritability is something that you will see leads to a lot of problems in the passive-aggressive's relationships, and it tends to be the same story over and over again. So the low self-esteem and the self-destructive behavior are really maladaptive expressions of these feelings that have been suppressed for so long, quite often due to early life experience with how these feelings tended to be dealt with. Ooh. Yeah, stayed out of the wall on that one. Alright, moving on. So this kind of never-ending irritability is something that can be quite draining for the individual who may come across as being somewhat passive and really contemptuous of people who don't behave in that same way. Alright, stayed out of the wall. Alright, bear with me one moment while we negotiate some of these turns. Okay. So some of the questions you might want to ask yourself if you feel that maybe passive aggression is something that you're struggling with. Do you ever smile when you're actually frustrated? Do you maybe perform a request really slowly, intentionally? Are you in the habit of perhaps taking an argument well past its logical conclusion? And how exactly would you characterize your need for control and manipulation? So once we kind of get a handle on a few of these sample questions, you can get an idea of exactly what it is that we're dealing with here. It's something that's, a feeling of resentment perhaps, but realizing that that resentment can't be explicitly expressed. So the idea is to take those feelings underground and perhaps get your own way in a way that allows you to deny responsibility, yet still fully participate in the negative interaction. So how does the cycle perpetuate itself? Well, first of all, there's going to be the self-fulfilling prophecy that gets created when that initial external stimulus comes in for these guys or girls, and what'll happen is there's that emotional reaction to it. But before the emotional reaction, there's, I guess, that initial thought pattern, maladaptive belief system perhaps, an irrational thought process, then the feelings from that, and those feelings tend to lead people to acting out or lashing out in some way. It could be aggressively or passive-aggressively in this case, and obviously that's going to have consequences. And whatever those consequences are, they conveniently seem to justify the initial irrational belief, and the cycle will start itself all over again. So why is it that this behavior doesn't correct itself? I mean, it doesn't really seem like it serves a lot of purpose, right? I mean, it wasn't too long ago that getting, I guess, slowly cast out of a group could have meant the, expulsion from the tribe, getting sent out into the jungle to fend for yourself. And this obviously would not have been a very adaptive situation for early hominids. Now, the passive-aggressive may actually be unaware that there's anything wrong, so if there's nothing to correct, obviously there's not really a huge incentive to change. There could be some tangible benefits to behaving this way for them. Ooh. They could actually lack the skills entirely necessary to make the changes in themselves. And that could be one of the things that's holding them back from that growth. And again, they could also be in an environment, perhaps, or with other individuals that perhaps continue to enable this behavior that's going to make that change next to impossible, because they're just going to relapse every time they're with these individuals or in that environment. And quite often, passive-aggressives would prefer to enjoy negative attention rather than no attention at all. So taking these things into account, even if there is, I suppose, an initial spark of hope for change, quite often, unless there are other factors taken into account, yeah, you might get a bit of an initial result, but that relapse is going to be quite likely if the environment around them and the underlying attitudes aren't really, looked at and possibly corrected if there are going to be factors that play into it. So what is it that we can do as individuals that maybe are on the receiving end or even on the giving end of this behavior? Now, I think the first and clearest point the author makes here is that you got to stop enabling. Now, there can be a number of different reasons of why we choose to enable. One of which, if you happen to be kind of a needy individual and you have to have your self-esteem validated externally, that's going to cause, obviously, a lot of easy manipulation if people know that they can get that out of you, right? If you happen to be a really gullible individual and you buy into a lot of these stories, then that may put you in a position of vulnerability where you're going to buy it. And if this naivety is costing you, then you might need to take a look at that and be a little bit more skeptical about some of the stories. There are also people who may classify themselves as caretakers. and use that as, I guess, a way of justifying being manipulated. I mean, if you feel the need to solve other people's problems, then you may be putting yourself in a lot of these situations, and you may need to look at that white knighting behavior, which I will be talking about in a later episode, the pathological altruism, so to speak. Sorry, let's just finish up this last weird corner here. Alright. So this behavior may be behavior you're willing to overlook, you know, for the sake of maintaining that copacetic relationship, but you're much more likely to be better off if you just address the behavior head on. Now, you may encounter a lot of excuses initially, but if you're just straight with the person and you're doing this from a place of kindness rather than a place of malice, you're much more likely to get the result that you seek. But again, remember, your duty first is to yourself. So make sure that you're... Wow, nice finish. Make sure that you are able to do what is best for you and deal with your anger in an exemplary way. Thanks for tuning into this live drive on the Shredding Skeptic.